Hello and welcome to the second season of Sunday Stories Live, brought to you by the 1947 Partition Archive, a global non-profit, non-governmental organization that works tirelessly to preserve the nearly lost oral histories of partition and has documented the life stories of more than 9,700 witnesses to the South Asian partition of 1947. The Oral History Project is the largest of its kind in South Asia. And with perseverance, passion, and dedication, they have made it possible to preserve unique stories in about 750 different cities and villages across 18 countries. Sunday Stories is an event series that will bring to you insightful and informative conversations with academics, scholars, historians, artists, poets, filmmakers, and musicians, as well as people's personal stories of the partition. Like the name suggests, it will take place every Sunday at the same time. So be sure to tune in every Sunday at the same time. My name is Sonam Kalra, and I'm a musician with my own personal interest and body of work on partition. And today I have the honor of being in conversation with a very, very special guest, Priya Satia, who is the Raymond A. Spruance Professor of International History and Professor of History at Stanford University in California. Her latest book, Time's Monster: History, Conscience, and Britain's Empire, has received fantastic reviews worldwide. Her previous book, Empire of Guns: The Violent Making of the Industrial Revolution, won several prizes as well, including the American Historical Association's Jerry Bentley Prize. Her first book, Spies in Arabia: The Great War and the Cultural Foundations of Britain's Covert Empire in the Middle East, also won multiple prizes, including the American Historical Association's Herbert Baxter Adams Prize. Her academic and popular writing has appeared in the American Historical Review, Technology and Culture, Financial Times, Slate, and The Nation, among others. As she says, historians are storytellers. And I love the fact that she says this because we often don't look at historians as storytellers. She says historians are storytellers, custodians of the past, repositories of collective memory, poetic interpreters of what it is to be truly human. Whether explaining our present or understanding the past on its own terms, their work critically shapes how the past infuses our present. Apart from this somewhat numinous role, their work also has the power to shape our future by informing debates on subjects like the war on terror, gun control, race, women in science, immigration, and so on. How beautifully said. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. We have with us Professor Priya Satia. Thank you so much, Priya, for being here. I was so quick to thank you because I was so excited that I didn't even introduce you. But thank you for being here on Sunday Stories. It's truly our privilege to have you here with us. And I know it's very early in the morning for you. So if I could, I'd ask everyone for a huge round of applause for you. But just let's imagine that they are really applauding you for doing this with us so very early in the morning.
Thank you so much, Sonam. It's an honor to be on this Partition Archives platform. And I'm a huge fan and admirer of this organization and of what you do as well. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Priya. So I'm going to jump right into it. I'm going to ask you the first question, which is really, we've talked so much. We talk about partition. There's this great interest in partition. But I really want to know from you, where did the idea of partition come from? How and why did partition come to be a part of British decolonization's toolkit from the 1920s to the 40s as part of some sort of a grand plan by them to ensure a continued imperial influence even after they left, even after independence?
Yeah, so there's two main ways in which British officials put partition on the table as part of India's process of independence. So one is sort of in the circumstances they created in 1946-47. So I'll get to that later. But first, from much earlier, they helped with the idea of partition as a way to solve conflict between two or more groups that can't seem to get along. They introduced that idea as somehow, in many cases, maybe necessary for decolonization. And so let me explain how that happened. So now the British have always been very flexible about how they go about what kind of relations they have with their colonies, right? So they've always, sometimes they have formal direct control of a place. Sometimes they rule indirectly through like a local ruler, and sometimes they rule informally. So for instance, Argentina was never actually a formal part of the British Empire, but its interaction with Britain was very similar to, say, Australia's, right? Even though we know Australia is part of the empire, but we don't think of Argentina as that.
Right.
So you can see the British accommodating, and they do this for a reason. This is how the British accommodate anti-colonial sentiment, because people in the colonies are always saying, we want freedom from this. And so, for instance, in Egypt, just to give one example, in 1922, they unilaterally declare that Egypt is independent. But in fact, nothing really changes. The British are still in control till 1956. And so they've always been willing to kind of grant nominal independence without changing the relationship in substance. And increasingly after World War I, they do this because of they have the Commonwealth. So the idea is that all these nominally independent polities are going to still be together in this club with Britain. And this is a time in which there's the Soviet Union coming up as a superpower. The United States is a superpower. They're continental in their size, and Britain is this little island. So they need the Commonwealth to be able to compete on the global stage. And it's important. Like, we think now of the Commonwealth as sort of, sports club, cricket club, Commonwealth Games, but at that time, the British didn't know it was going to turn out that way, right? They had a lot of faith in it being a really politically and economically important unit. It was the Sterling bloc, almost maps onto the Commonwealth, not exactly. So they're really betting a lot on the Commonwealth. So when these anti-colonial movements in places like India start getting really strong in the 1920s, the British objective is, okay, we're going to grant independence, but keep everything the same by having those independent countries join the Commonwealth. And partition became a very helpful idea in that, because the idea was that if we divide the new polity, and then whatever fragments emerge are sort of both included in the Commonwealth, then the British are in a position to continue to manage the trouble between those two places. And that's exactly the story that justified the British presence in South Asia from the beginning, that they were there, as in Ireland or Iraq or any number of colonies, they justify their presence by saying, we're here because if we're not here, there will be anarchy because these different groups in these diverse places don't get along. And they really saw, Muslims in India and Hindus in India as two separate nations, inherently incompatible. And we can talk later about how they actually made that a reality. So that's one set of things. And then at the same time, they have this habit of drawing lines arbitrarily on a map to create new polities. Like they did the Scramble for Africa. You can think of the Durand Line between Afghanistan and British India. But what you see with Ireland in 1921 is the first time that they say, we're going to do a partition as part of decolonizing Ireland, that this is going to be the kind of the price of Ireland getting more autonomy, but there's going to be two Irelands, and the British are again going to have that oversight over the relations between those two fragments. And then they try to do the same thing in Palestine in the 1930s, and then they bring the same, and it's the same officials in each. There's a historian named Reginald Coupland, who's an academic historian who has these ideas about how different parts of the world develop and have to go through this federalization process, like the Commonwealth. And they're also officials who have administrative power. So they're moving from Ireland to Palestine to India and saying, now we'll try the same idea here, now we'll try the same idea here. So basically at bottom then what you have is a kind of continuation of a divide and rule tactic, right?
Yeah.
It will give independence, but it will be divided, and then we will maintain that position of authority over whatever emerges. So that's one set of ways that officials British officials put the idea of partition on the table. But it actually turns out that Coupland says partition won't work in India because it's too big, the population is too much, there are other minorities like Sikhs. But the thing is that having introduced that idea, what happens is that Indians coming from very different perspectives pick up this idea of partition and in a very different way, and it sort of takes on its own life. So I'll stop here for now, but we can talk about how that happens as well.
But it's super interesting. I mean, also to weaken, essentially to just weaken a nation even after you've left it, to ensure that you can still continue to have that power. Now, the next, I mean, I know you have this great interest in poetry, so I'm going to recite poetry to you, but I want to actually talk about 1857. And I was also reading about this, and I found it so interesting that Mirza Ghalib, one of our greatest poets, was in Delhi when the uprising of 1857 was at its peak. He observed the revolutionary changes taking place during his time. And, I know he was one of your favorite poets. He kept a historical journal from May 11, 1857 till July 1, 1858. And he documents what he sees and hears about nearly 15 months of conflict. So I'm just going to, recite to you what he says, and forgive me if I don't pronounce this correctly. He says, "Matae loho kalam chin gaye to kya gam hai, ke khoone dil mein duboli hai ungliyan maine. Zaba pe mohr lagi hai to kya, ke rakh di hai har ek halke zanjeer mein zuba maine. Why bother now that the tablet and the pen have been seized? I have dipped my fingers in my heart's blood. Why bother that the tongue has been silenced? I have placed my tongue in each of the fetters." So can you talk to us, about this revolt of 1857 and, why and how the British politicized religious identity in India in a new way after this revolt, after this rebellion in 1857?
Yes, absolutely. This is such an important turning point, because if you look at what happened in 1857, there was such diverse participation in that rebellion. There were, workers, there were peasants, there were, of course, soldiers, there were princes and rulers, there were Hindus and Muslims. It was not like it was a united block of different categories of society, right? Yeah, and it was very, very difficult for the British to crush this rebellion, and they only did crush it by resorting to very barbarous tactics. So after this rebellion, they were determined to never let that kind of united bloc against their rule form again, right? So they start building not just religious differences, but also, caste differences, linguistic differences, all those differences into colonial governance. So it's all recorded in a new way in, for instance, censuses or in different policies. And when identities, it's hard for us to imagine this, but in the 19th century, even something like a religious identity or caste identity could be very fluid, could be quite locally based, right? Like there could be no equivalent for what you are in your corner of Punjab, with what someone in some corner of Kerala is, right? But because the census is on this vast scale, they standardize it in a new way. So those differences become harder and more concrete. And then there are certain policies that are very clearly aimed at basically divide and rule, like the division of Bengal in 1905 is very explicitly, the British officials say, we're doing this there's so much anti-colonial sentiment in Bengal, this will pull away that unity, and it'll be easier for us to govern. And of course, there's so much protest against that they have to undo that partition. And then they finally, to appease those anti-colonials, they create electorates for Indian people to actually begin to participate in local governance in 1909. But the electorates are based on religion. So there's separate electorates based on your religion. And once that happens, that means if you're an Indian person who wants to participate, you've got to create newspapers and a political organization and all those things based only on religion. So then these paths start to become, those religious identities become harder and more they have more political meaning and political purchase. But still, I would say that doesn't mean it's inevitable that you get to partition in 1947. There's a certain confluence of events, in 1946, 47, that I think at that point it becomes hard to avoid. But until then, I think there were still lots of alternatives possible. And you can see still signs of unity across religion all throughout this period in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. But the potential for partition was there because the ideas that start to circulate and because of the way religious identity becomes politicized in a new way after 1857.
It's interesting, though, that hasn't changed in the world in so many ways, right? I mean, religious identity still becomes the base of most.
I think that's because the state structures we have, like Indian state structures today, are those same ones that have been inherited from the British. They didn't revolutionize them enough and start anew, with more anti-colonial or post-colonial structures. Instead, they just continued with that inheritance. And so the legacies of the period of colonial rule persist. They have such a long afterlife.
Yeah. The imperial power still has power over us. For those of you who are just joining, you're watching the Sunday Stories live from the 1947 Partition Archive. This is season 2, and with us is our third guest this season, Professor Priya Satia. So we're talking about, she's done her research in history, in partitions, in colonial history. So it's actually super exciting and interesting to be speaking to her. The next question that we're going to be asking is that for many people, it was long unclear. And you just said that there was no certainty that it would lead to partition. So for many people, it was long unclear what partition would even mean. I don't think many people actually fathomed that it would mean two distinct nation states with such a hard border, like this concrete border. And so tell me about that. Talk to us about that. How did it, what was going on in people's heads at the time?
So as I said, Indians sort of take up this idea of partition in their own way once the British have kind of put it on the table. So I think the really important context for understanding why they do that is the world wars are happening in this time. And people who are interested in freedom from colonialism are trying to figure out, well, what will that look like? Does that mean we'll become a nation? Because what they're seeing is that nationalism is a really destructive power. That's what World War I shows. That's what World War II confirms. So, and then on the other side, they're seeing the Soviet Union emerge. And that's a very, in theory at least, anti-national federal organization. And that's a really interesting alternative to think about, that maybe the end of anti-colonialism is not nationalism and a nation, but something much more federal, something much more cosmopolitan. So even you can see this then among all these anti-colonial thinkers that are so familiar to us, like Gandhi's talking about India as an international federation of village republics, right? And Tagore is also warning about nation-centered views. And I think it's really important to think of Iqbal, who's credited with introducing the idea of partition in 1930. He said, he's like thinking along these lines too. He's thinking that, okay, nationalism is very dangerous. It's very, there are no ethics in it, right? Because there's no religion in it. So he's saying that maybe the solution is to have a federal structure, a Muslim India within India, in which Muslims and non-Muslims will live together in a much more in a polity that is open about its ethical commitments, which are going to be religious commitments. And there's pan-Islamism, there's pan-Asianism, there's international communism. So a lot of people, thinkers in this period, are actually not thinking about, the Indian nation or the Pakistani nation as the end result. So even when they're thinking about Pakistan, they're not necessarily thinking about a whole separate nation state, right? So obviously then partition does take a particular form in 1946-47, but because people have been thinking about it so creatively all these 2 decades before, it's not even clear when it happens in 1947 which version of the story is going to play out, right? A lot of government functions are still shared, like the Reserve Bank of India is the bank for both till the middle of 1948. So Indian accountants are working for the Pakistani government. The border is really open. People go back and forth. there's a huge rebellion in the middle of India, right, in Hyderabad. It's a communist rebellion. The next year, there's a communist rebellion in China. From the point of view, especially of people on the left, and a lot of these poet figures of this period were on the left in the progressive writers movement, those are some of the people I've focused on. They're thinking, okay, this partition happened, but this is a temporary moment. We're actually on the verge of a global revolution,
Yeah.
And so we don't know how this, and look at the shape of Pakistan, these two wings separated by 1,000 miles of Indian territory. Maybe this is going to be like open border, federation, something like that, or it's about to end and the Chinese Revolution is going to come here. Or
no, but that's such an incredible point. I think that for you to just describe it the way you did as two wings, I mean, they clearly, obviously thought they would be able to access each other. Otherwise, you would never choose two wings on either side so far apart, east and west, right? Well,
I think that's the trace of the creativity of that period in the 1920s and 30s when they're trying to think outside the box of the standard Western idea of the nation state. And that form, the physical territorial form that Pakistan has at the beginning is the trace of that, I think.
Yeah. But so that's really interesting. But tell me about the poets that I read somewhere that you've been researching the works of poets who wrote about that time. And of course, poetry interests me greatly. I mean, one of the things that I remember reading was when Ali Sardar Jafri, one of the poems he's written, he says, "Isi sarhad pe kal dooba tha suraj hoke do tukre." And he ends by saying, and he says, "Isi sarhad pe kal," he refers to how the dawn of freedom happened. Subhe Azadi, this is where the dawn of freedom happened. But he ends by saying, "Isi sarhad pe kab se baitha hu muntazir ke kate ranjish ki shab aur uge suraj mohabbat ka." So I mean, exactly what you're saying. I don't think they realize that at any point there would be this hard divide, there would be this hatred. So who are the other poets that you've actually been, that you found have interesting voices at this time? Poet activists or just voices of the time there?
It's just really amazing how many of the key figures in this period were poets. Like we just mentioned Iqbal. Obviously, he's a major political thinker, but he's a major poet. Hasrat Mohani, even before Iqbal, he was also suggested a kind of federation of Muslim spaces in a broader India. That was 1924. He's also a major political figure, a major journalist, but also a major poet, right? And you just remembered mentioned Ali Sardar Jafri, and then of course there's somebody like Faiz Ahmed Faiz, who's a poet. He's a communist. He's a journalist. He also is a political figure. And he's in the army in World War II. But, even at the end of his very famous poem about 1947, which he writes a few years later in 1951, I think, it ends with, "Chale chalo ki wo manzil abhi nahi aayi." Right? So this is the idea that this is not the end. This is not settled.
Right.
Everything is not settled now. Let's keep going. We will land in a much better place eventually.
But you also hear a sense of despair when he says later, when he visits Pakistan first, when he says, "Hum ke thehre ajnabi itni madaraton ke baad." Well, he says, "I've come back to," when he goes to Bangladesh, and I think he just feels the sense of being, of sadness that at everything that's happened. I think that's in the 70s when he goes back, and so it's. But what's so interesting, I mean, I know that when we were talking earlier, these are such interesting sort of lines that are blurred between poets and activists and leaders and politicians. And you were talking to us about how historians have this massive role to play. And talk to me about that, because I find that's such an interesting concept. And it's also not something that we all think of. We generally just tend to, put a historian in a little box and say, they're behind a desk and that's all they do.
Yeah.
Talk to us about this incredible finding there. And that's really what such a large part of your work is about when you say historians are storytellers.
You mean like about historians' political role?
Yeah, exactly.
That's the subject of my book that came out in the fall called Time's Monster. It comes out of my own struggle to understand my role in public debate as a historian, right? And I go back and see there's a whole history of this, where if you just think of someone like Winston Churchill, right? He's a major politician and has, holds very powerful posts throughout his career. The whole time, he's also a historian. And he was not unique. I think the role of historians vis-a-vis the halls of power really shifted after Churchill's time because of what happened in World War II. But until his time, I think, you see a pattern of the most influential historians of the 18th and 19th and early 20th centuries were also, I'm talking about the British case, were also very high-ranking, powerful bureaucrats and politicians. If you think of Thomas Macaulay, who who wrote the famous Minute on Indian Education, who was behind, pushing for English language to replace Persian, who was part of the Law Council of India. While he was in India, he decides to write an epic history of England, which becomes one of the most popular history books, in the middle of the 19th century. And it has nothing to do with India, but he's thinking to write it because of how he's thinking about how he wants English people to be invested in the kind of stuff he's doing in India. So make them proud of their past, make them feel that this is their rightful role, is to colonize and uplift, civilize other parts of the world. So here's one example. You can think of John Stuart Mill, you can think of J.R. Seeley. There's so many, there's a pattern, just like there are a pattern of poets as anti-colonial figures, there's a pattern of British historians in this period as like very powerful bureaucrats and politicians. And then that changes after World War II. And there's a really interesting story about that change happens partly because these anti-colonial poets become friends with a really important historian named Edward Thompson. And his son is E.P. Thompson, who's, really changed in the 1950s and 60s how British people thought about, the purpose of history and what its relationship towards the state should be. And it was much more of the sense of we should be opposed to the state. We should be telling truth against the state rather than helping the state in its, colonizing or oppressive efforts. So there's a connection between these two worlds in the 1930s.
It's amazing. You also said something yesterday which was interesting about how when the British, and I'm jumping back a bit, but when the British colonized nations, or this whole justification that they had of doing it for progress, and sort of the narrative of history then changes. So all the bad that you do, or all the oppression that you might cause, or the traumas that you might make a certain nation go through, that's all justified in the name of progress. And tell us a little bit more about that, because I found it such an interesting concept, And it's still continuing. What's so interesting about history is it's so much the present. And that's what I got from my conversation with you. I was just like, history is so now. And that's
what Walter Benjamin said, right? Time is not homogeneous and empty. It's filled with the presence of the now, right? So, absolutely. Like in the 18th century, right, when modern colonialism is taking off, at that point, you see the introduction of, in Britain and broadly in Europe, it's a transatlantic story, also, new ideas about history, that it has to be a story of progress. This is new. We think this is default thinking for us now. We just think, of course, history is progress. But we are facing climate crisis. There's no way after World War II anyone could say, okay, history is about progress, right? The Holocaust was not progress, right? And climate crisis shows us we're not going to, just come out of this better and better.
Exactly,
better and better.
Exactly, right.
In the 18th century, of course, they didn't know that, right? So they just, you see this effort amongst Enlightenment philosophers of that period in Europe to figure out, like, it's a kind of religious question they have, that why does evil happen in the world? Why does God allow evil to happen in the world? And the answer they come up with is that, okay, maybe it seems evil to us now, but in time, we will discover that it has served some process of progress.
Right.
So even though sometimes we feel uncomfortable with what's happening or how we're participating in it, to be a British man of a certain class, you have to be stoical, suppress those qualms, and do it anyway in faith that eventually it will turn out well. And this is very much the mindset of all these figures that we've already talked about, whether it's Macaulay or Mill or even Churchill, for sure, thought this way.
Yeah. So you've also done a great research on partitions. There's an article that, or a chapter in a book that you've done, which is called Partitions as well. So
Mhm.
tell me, why do countries still see it as a solution?
Yeah,
Why
I
do
think,
so many countries across the
yeah,
world still see it as a
I know
solution?
this partition has been tried in so many places, whether it's Ireland, India. After India, it was Cyprus. And you can think of other partitions, like even Korea or Germany, in different contexts a little bit, but there's no evidence that it ever works, right? There's always tremendous bloodshed. There's always continued conflict between the two units that are made from it, right? Like India and Pakistan, there's no peace there, right?
And trauma for
And
generations,
trauma for
scarring in so many
generations. And
generations.
still today, you find that people who make these kind of decisions in spaces of international governance, the kind of heirs of the imperial bureaucracies, they still keep suggesting this as a solution to conflicts, whether it's Syria, whether it's Sudan, whether it's even Israel-Palestine still. And I think that's because of this continued commitment to the idea of progress, and the continued commitment to the idea that the nation is the end point of history. So you have to get there, and there might be a certain amount of bloodshed on the way, but just like those Enlightenment thinkers are thinking, you have to be able to tolerate that. That's the price you pay for progress. So I think it's the stickiness of that mentality that, and also it's the ignorance about just how dysfunctional and failed these earlier partitions were, and the idea that if they were violent, that's because Indians are like that, right?
Right.
So there's a racism also there that says it's not about partition, it's about the people that are involved, and these people are going to be like that, right? So so I think that's why those ideas are still always on the table, and now we see them even coming back to haunt Britain itself. You can think about Brexit and the breakup of the United Kingdom, potential breakup of the United Kingdom, as yet another chapter in the story of partition, or some kind of historical poetic retribution.
Well, they've done, yeah, exactly. I was saying it just happened to them themselves. But when you talked earlier of how it's sort of the idea of partition got adopted by Indians, so how did that happen? I mean, how did they justify wanting this, whatever they thought would be partition? And I know that large parts of different, factions took it on and said this is the only way forward. And how did the 1947 partition of India unfold? I mean, why did it unfold the way it did, with so much bloodshed? It turned out to be the largest mass displacement in the history of humanity. And there was so much sudden hatred in some ways of a land that had lived together. So what are your takeaways from your research or that you've done that you could share with us?
Yeah, I think just on the second part of your question, I think Yasmin Khan, who may have already been on one of your shows, she has a really persuasive answer to this, which is that it's a very, sorry to use a technical word, but very contingent result that happens that makes partition unfold as it does and unfold so violently. And it has to do with the way the British, this was the second piece of how British officials shaped partition, the way they did the transfer of power, the arrangements for that, and the context of the immediate moment after World War II. So what happens is that everyone's arguing about, should there be partition, should there be a federal structure, what's India going to look like, right? And in the meantime, while that's being worked out, the British are speeding up the decolonization process. They're being very hasty, and that very fact makes partition more likely and violent partition more likely. So they're cutting their losses, they're cutting their investment in intelligence units, police units, they're forbidding their own army units from helping in any way, taking any kind of peacekeeping action. The population itself there's been, a lot of people, millions of young men have been in World War II. They've seen different kinds of violence. There's a lot of arms and guns and bombs around left over from the war. And the groups that were against partition and that were for nonviolence have been jailed during the war, right? And so some of their influence is undercut. And in the meantime, groups that have been exposed to, fascist ideas and things, during that war, which was a war against fascism, they start to get more influential, and they step into the power vacuum that's created by the fact that police units and army units are being run down, right? So then you have these paramilitary organizations that are well armed, and that embrace violence, and they are responsible for the majority of the violence that happens in partition. So there's sort of a breakdown of all authority and a total abdication of responsibility by the British, especially, and a time of, you can imagine when there's no governance. It's a question of survival, right? And so your religious identity, it's like a 0-1 thing, becomes important in a new way, and meaningful in a new way. In that moment, it doesn't say anything about what it meant in early or later. It's something very particular to that context. And the British officials who are starting to prepare for their own departure and get back to England, their mentality is that, we're here because Hindus and Muslims can't get along. So obviously if we leave, they still won't get along. So they're going to fly at each other's throats. So there's nothing we can do about it. So I'm just going to leave, right? That was their own kind of racist outlook. It was very fatalistic and self-fulfilling then. So they literally offered no governance. And they were the ones who had the power to govern in that moment. And so it just became sort of this nightmarish scenario that, if it had been handled differently, it's very conceivable that lots of different things might have happened.
Of course. And I think I heard an interview of an army chief. He's now in Pakistan. Well, he was in Pakistan. I don't know if he's still alive, but he talks of how exactly even the army had been split. And he said safe passage in the caravans that went across of people. There was no one to even accompany these people. And half of them were looking out for even the army people were looking out for their own families because they didn't know. Right. By the end of it, it really did become, each man to himself. But you have sort of roots in Pakistan as well, as do I. So what was your personal Pakistan story? Was your family affected by the event? And what was it like? Have they even spoken about what it was like to live through that turbulent time?
Yes. Like many Punjabis, I have a partition story in my family. So my mother's family is from Multan, and they were perfumers, itar wale, right? So they really wanted to stay in Multan because their supply chain was from there. So they did try to stay, and then in 1948, I believe, they finally came to Delhi. They went to Old Delhi, and so they were refugees who left. And on my father's side, we're from Muxar, which is very close to the border. But my dadi, I hope the audience knows what these were. My paternal grandmother.
Yes, that's dadi.
From Gujranwala, which is also on the Pakistan side. So her family migrated. A lot of her relatives moved to the Muxar area because obviously she was there, right? And with her husband, my dada. So there's a huge masjid in front of our house in Muxar. It's this haunting, beautiful building that's there, and that it's like, underused, unused. And so I'm actually in the middle of conversations with my eldest Tayaji to find out more about what happened in Muxar in particular, just because it was on the border, and he, lots of people left and lots of new people came. I do know that. So I grew up hearing stories, especially from my nani, my maternal grandmother. She was very nostalgic about Multan, but she was very, she called partition katai, and she meant it in the sense of land being cut, but also, the
people and the killings. The killings.
Yeah, she used to always talk about the sarais that her father had outside Multan. Because में 60 कमरे होते थे, and she loved to tell me stories about that. I think that cultivated not just my interest in partition, but in history. So I first became a historian to study partition, and then I had this long detour where I now have wound up back again, partly thanks to Partition Archive.
Well, that's amazing. One of the things I think that at least I've heard a lot of partition, I won't call them survivors, but people who've sort of lived through partition say that we never thought we wouldn't go back. And that's really that. When you talk of that sense of nostalgia, absolutely it is. And even when you talk of the Pakistans being on either side, there was never a sense of finality, I think. What I find very interesting in your book, and the title of your book, you use the word conscience. And I want to know why. you say Times Monster, History, Conscience, and Britain's Empire. So why did you want to talk about conscience?
I've
What
always
role?
been interested in conscience, like in everything I've ever done as a historian. Like, why do human beings? That's why I mean, at the quote you read at the beginning, like what it means to be human. Like, why do we as human beings do such terrible things, right? And the British are no more uniquely villainous than any other people, right? Like the Germans did the Holocaust, but now they, you know, that was a moment of his time in history. I've always been
Yeah,
curious about that, and even, you know, if you think about partition that way, why did we do that? So, but what I found was this idea of progress, that history is progress, was the intention of that was to manage conscience, and the effect of it was to manage conscience. So all the time the British are feeling guilty. And this comes out in the romantic poetry of the British also, and they have their own
right.
poetic
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
antidotes to this. And they're
yeah.
always expressing guilty conscience. All these big figures like Lord Salisbury and George Orwell, they write in their diaries. I mean, you just think about Orwell and the guilt he expresses about empire in like a story like Shooting an Elephant, right?
Yeah.
Shame and guilt. And so they're always confessing it in some place or another, but it's like a martyr complex. It's like, we have to do this because we're serving history by spreading our way of life all over the world, right? So I feel like that's like a big story of British imperialism, is the management of conscience. And finally, when I wrote this book, I felt like, okay, the ideas of history were really important in doing that. And those ideas of history were not really secular the way we think they are. They came from a religious worry about why God tolerates evil in the world. And in many South Asian philosophies, I mean, of course, now, even in India, people think in terms of progress, and that's the whole development mentality. But in our own indigenous traditions, there tends to be much more of a sense of good and evil always coexist. You don't
Right.
expect to have evil, 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 and then it will turn out good. You expect always good and evil to coexist. So that's a very different mindset, and I think it might be worth, recovering that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. What are you working on next, Priya? I mean, since you've already covered so many different things in so many different books, I'm just really intrigued to know what it is that you're going to be working on next, and what are you going to dive deep into, or have you already dived deep into?
Actually, I have an idea for a book. If this quarantine ends and we can get back into archives and traveling and all, my two things. One, I want to do a history of the British Empire for younger readers. I feel like there's a real
That's
need for
fantastic.
that for
Yeah,
educational purposes. And
yeah,
secondly, I want to do something on pre-partition. I'm thinking of it as like buried histories of Punjab and different anti-colonial moments, from the late 19th, sort of post 1857 till the 1930s, and just to kind of explore alternative trajectories, like what kind of different futures could Punjab have had if partition hadn't kind of
right.
disrupted things the way it did. And I think because of our preoccupation with partition and the India-Pakistan conflict, we've sort of like haven't really explored fully the potential and the different ideas that were in play before. And some of that may include looking into what happened, what my own hometown and my own family was involved in the anti-colonial movement. So I hope to be able to explore that personal angle to that.
That would be absolutely amazing. But also, I mean, since you're talking of the Punjab and how things could have happened differently, one of the things just popped into my head, and we talk about it a lot, and we have a very sketchy um, reenactment, sketchy story that's told. And I'm just wondering if you'd ever done more research on the Jallianwala Bagh, and what really transpired, and or is there any sort of thing that you found out that you could maybe share with us? And because it was such a traumatic
Yeah.
moment for Punjab, right?
Jallianwala Bagh, the person just talked, the kind of expert on it, I would say today, is Kim Wagner, who's in England. He's a wonderful historian. Maybe you guys, maybe we could invite him
Yeah,
on the show.
Vanita, if you're listening, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, what I find really interesting about that is how it's often singled out as this exception. I mean, the British
Yeah,
especially single out as that was bad. Like Churchill said, this is an event with no parallel in our story of colonialism, and obviously it's completely wrong. I mean, there's so many events like that. So it's not an exception. It's of a piece with. It's part of a pattern of excessive use of violence terrorizing violence that's used again and again. I mean, right after that, they bomb Gujranwala. There are protests in Gujranwala against the Amritsar massacre, and the British bring in airplanes and bomb Gujranwala, right? Right then. So it continues, and they're doing like bombing, like policing with bombs from the air in the Middle East in that same period, and that's the subject of my first book. And so I just think there's a pattern of colonial violence, and we shouldn't think about this 1919 Amritsar massacre as an exception that needs a specific apology for that, right? Like now there are these conversations about should they apologize. If they apologize for that, it may imply, okay, that was bad, but the rest was okay. Not at all. That was representative of the nature
all that was bad. All that was bad. Yeah. Exactly. No. Yeah. Well, I'm going to open the floor up for questions for those of you who are on. You're watching Sunday Stories live from the 1947 Partition archive, and we are with Professor Priya Satia. We're just waiting to see if there are any questions. Sajida Banu says, 1857, an example? I'm not quite sure I understand that question. Priya, did you kind of understand what? 1857, an example?
I'm not sure. Do you mean like an example of what happened in 1857?
Perhaps.
It starts in Meerut, right? With these soldiers in the British Indian Army, the East India Company Army. There are rumors that the bullets they've been given new rifles, and to load them, you have to put the cartridge in your mouth and rip off the cover and load it. And there's rumors that there is pork fat and beef fat on there. And this is the story that how they don't want to do that. They don't want to pollute themselves, and they mutiny, and they decide to march to Delhi. And along the way, other kinds of people join, and they declare Bahadur Shah Zafar, another poet also, as the figurehead of this rebellion. And obviously this match can't be lit just like that. There have been tensions brewing, there have been rebellions ongoing as you get up to that point, but this one becomes a huge rebellion. It's just larger than the earlier ones. And there's much more coordination between different groups. And so it takes the British an entire year. It's a war, actually, right? That the British eventually win. I hope that helps. Can you throw light on 1857 as the pattern? You mean the crushing of it or the rebellion against it?
No, I think that your answer was actually a sort of, it's exactly the pattern of this whole, it went straight up. What are the most, Rita Parsi says, what are the most important and revealing sources of info for research on the late 1800s?
Well, it really depends what you want to know about, right? If, like, for the things that I've just written about in my new book, it was about historians and intellectual history. So for that, you would look at, there are a lot of published works. You could look at the private papers of those historians. But if you want to study, like, how ordinary people went through some particular historical event, you may have to look into other kinds of records, like censuses or court records, or sometimes oral histories, like the Partition archive has its oral histories just of 1947. But you might be able to find, even within those, memories from much earlier periods can be dredged up too. So it depends on the question you're asking. That's the historian's craft. So for different kinds of questions, you go to different kinds of sources, different kinds of archives. So the Partition Archive is an organization for oral history. That's what the archive does. So it's used much more frequently for historical questions that are about. It's most helpful when it's about the living past, right? So we still have access to people who were there, and that's why there's this race against time to collect their stories into the Partition archive. But things that are more remote in the past, obviously it's harder to get new oral histories, but sometimes in the 19th and early 20th century, people at that time recorded oral histories. Like British anthropologists would always do that, right? And we still have access to those, although you have to pay attention to the fact that there's colonial politics around the way they were collected.
So Parul Kapoor Hinzan says that the British have quotas for Muslims in police and army, especially in the Punjab. By that I mean the majority of police and army soldiers were Muslim. Was this happenstance or by British design?
Okay, so after 1857, the British become very determined to recruit from areas that they felt had been more loyal and hadn't joined the rebellion, and those tended to be the places that were most recently conquered. So like Punjab had just been conquered in 1849, was pretty flattened and not able to rebel in 1857 that much, right? Although that's not to say there weren't Punjabi rebels. In fact, many of them wound up in California, and then their descendants founded the Ghadar Party. And that's name Ghadar. That's an homage to 1857 rebels. So they also had this martial race theory that certain, this was part of their whole racism, science of race in the second half of the century, that certain people in India are better meant for martial work than others, and they thought that Punjabis had that quality, and that Bengalis were effeminate. And I mean, it's all rubbish, right? Although I think a lot of Indians have internalized some of these ways of thinking, and because when they get to a point where they're conquering other parts of the Middle East in the 20th century, when they break up the Ottoman Empire, they rule Iraq. They have more formal control even of Egypt, Jordan, Palestine, all that. They get much more concerned about making sure Muslims in the Indian army and police are happy. They have this kind of paranoid understanding of Muslims as if they're all about to unify in a giant global rebellion to destroy the British Empire. And there were pan-Islamic movements at the time, so it's not entirely crazy. But so there were politics around, favoring different communities that were coming out of their bigger concerns about, their priorities in the empire. So that's
it also fed in, as you said, to their divide and rule policy. I mean, everything was still about creating the division.
Yeah, after 1857, they also decided never to station troops that have been recruited from that region in that region. So if there's a regiment of Bengalis or whatever, they're going to be posted to Madras, and you'll never have Bengali because they're going to emphasize with the local population, and they won't follow orders. So that was another kind of new rule they introduced. And the other thing I should say is that they also, after that point, there was a lot of political repression after, and I think Ghalib is lamenting some of that, and he himself goes for refuge to I think Rampur, right after. He's like kind of in exile from Delhi. But there's a lot of political repression. But the one thing the British do affirm after 1857 is that, okay, from now on, we're not going to interfere in your religion, because they think that the whole bullet thing triggered this fanaticism that they don't even understand, like the political meaning of the rebellion. So they say our mistake was that we interfered in religion, so we won't do that. And that meant that Indians who wanted to protest colonialism had more freedom to do that in religious terms than in political terms. And that also contributed to the politicization of religion. It's the one way you can push back against colonialism.
So Pritika Chaudhary says this is a really awesome episode, and I'm going to get Priya Satia's books and consume them. Can Priya please talk about her books and in short what each book is about?
Oh, I'd love to. Thank you. Yeah, the first one is called Spies in Arabia, The Great War and the Cultural Foundations of Britain's Covert Empire in the Middle East. That came out in 2008. That's, probably the most academic of my books. It's meant for other historians, but you're very welcome and encouraged to check it out. And it's about British conquest of and rule of the Middle East and how they came to invent aerial policing in that part of the world. And there's such, robust echoes of that down to our time. These are the exact same places where the US uses drone surveillance today. So I wrote a lot about that as well. The second book came out in 2018. It's called Empire of Guns, and that's about the 18th century and the British Industrial Revolution. And I make an argument that it wasn't driven just by brilliant entrepreneurs, but by the fact that Britain was always at war, and the government's demand for war material, basically military contracting, is what drove the Industrial Revolution. And so I focus on the firearms industry, and there's a big section in there about India and the way the British worked really hard to crush the Indian firearms industry, because they knew that if they let it continue, there would be an industrial revolution in India. That's how they understood the sources of industrial revolution, even in their own time. And then that would mess up their economic ties with India, because they wanted India to be a supplier of raw materials, right? And then the third book, I'll just show it to you. This is Time's Monster, History, Conscience, and Britain's Empire. This is the cover in outside North America. So there's an interesting Commonwealth story. This is the US cover, a slightly different title. So, you know, I have a different publisher in the US and UK, and I think that's one way that the Commonwealth still exercise a kind of cultural influence. Like if you try and publish a book in Britain, they will often claim rights in all the former parts of the empire, right? And in India, you'll often get the UK edition, and so will Australia, and so will New Zealand, and so on. So there is still that does control what gets said, right? Someone has written a new book, I'm forgetting the name of it. There's a new one on this continued cultural power of the Commonwealth, and publishing and radio and things like that being really important in it still, like the BBC and things like that.
So Najam Sethi says, at what stage did the Brits decide irrevocably to partition India, and why?
So I don't think there is a moment when the British do that. I think all parties, Indian parties, agree to it. So this guy, Reginald Coupland, actually says, no, maybe we shouldn't do partition in India. But by that time, as I said, a lot of Indian political organizations have become wedded to the idea in different ways, although it's not clear they know what it's going to mean, right? Yeah. And so then there are these negotiations that happen from during World War II, but continuing through early 1947. And it's only in the summer of 1947, May, June, that it's clear that there's going to be a partition, although no one says what that's going to mean or what it's going to look like. And some parties, like the Jamiat Ulema, they never agreed to partition, right? That's the group representing most of the ulema in India. They like Maulana Madani is the leader of that. They never agree, but other Indian parties do agree, and then that becomes a plan. And then it's a question of, okay, how to do it. And then Cyril Radcliffe is locked up in a mansion with these maps. He knows nothing about India, and he's under heavy guard, and he's the one who does the division. And it's announced after Independence Day. It's announced a couple of days, maybe 2 days after August 15th. So that's what I mean by it's this time of terror and fear and confusion. No one knows what to do and what's going to happen and whether they're in danger or not. And everyone who's a minority anywhere just fears for their life. And that just creates a situation that's very, very dangerous for everyone, especially with the paramilitaries.
Also, there was no sort of strategy that was put into place of this is when you should travel, this would be the safe passage. It was just utter chaos. It's just like, that's it. You shouldn't be here. We're partitioned. And then all the communal, violence started. And as you said, it was organized. That was what was even more frightening about it.
Yeah. So the British are deciding to partition, and the Indian political parties are deciding partition. Nobody is deciding population exchange. That's never officially decided. That starts to happen because of the decisions people are forced to make on the ground. Like some people want to go to Pakistan because they love that idea and they want to be there and they believe in it. That's one thing. But many people are being hounded out, right? So that's not something that's being ordered from on high. That's something that's happening because the context is one of no governance and total fear and confusion. And as you said, many of them think they're doing this temporarily and they're going to come back. And that again is testimony to the fact that a lot of people didn't necessarily realize that 2 permanent nation states with a hard border was what was being
And also, I don't think anyone ever really chooses to go out and become a refugee. So that's, when we talk of, even with disdain, there are many conversations that I had about refugees with great disdain, as if they're this great menace to society. But I think what people forget to think about is that you don't choose to become a refugee.
No, yeah. Like my mother's family, they didn't want to leave. And then they had to leave. They tried to stay even. So these are not, you don't have a lot of control in your life decisions often.
No, absolutely. And that's what's so heartbreaking about it. And
yes.
Ahuja asks us, he says, were the British worried that India would lean towards Russia and socialism? And was that the major reason for dividing India?
That's an interesting question. So a lot of Indian leaders were leading towards Russia and socialism. Like the Soviet Union, it was so inspiring because it questioned the whole narrative of progress. It's like, you don't have to gradually be like the British. You can do 5-year plans and leap ahead and go from this completely agrarian country to a completely industrialized country. And they didn't know the truth of how the Soviet Union actually was, right? But there was so much admiration, not just in India, but all over the colonized world. Like this was the great alternative, goal of an anti-colonial movement anywhere. So were the British very worried about that? I think they really felt that once they knew that India and Pakistan were both going to be in the Commonwealth, they felt a lot of security in that. Like that would give them a continued international bond. They, of course, as I said earlier, didn't realize that the Commonwealth wasn't going to be a very politically powerful body. Although that's not to say I don't want to totally dismiss the political power that it still does have. But I think that was why the Commonwealth was so important, that it was a way to kind of push back against too much Soviet influence in whatever new polities emerged in South Asia.
Nand Chandan asks, did the idea of two nations come from Lord Durham's view of Canada as two nations warring in the bosom of one country?
That's interesting too. I haven't actually, that's a really good analogy to think about Canada and the Quebec question as part of a similar, and you see there too, the reason that the Canadian Constitution stayed in British hands, even though Canada had independence and just about everything else, the UK still held control of the Canadian Constitution until the 1980s, was because of the same thing, that you need us to manage the conflict between Quebec and the rest of Canada. So very similar to the idea that India-Pakistan will be managed by us in the Commonwealth. So that's an interesting analogy. I don't know actually the answer of whether Lord Durham, and there may be a way to trace whether some of these British historians who were talking about partition in the 20th century, how much they had thought about Canada. What I have found is that they were actually thinking a lot about the United Kingdom, that, okay, we have this single nation now of the United Kingdom, but it has these constituent pieces of Scotland, Wales, England, and Ireland, and we were all, against each other, and eventually we came together as this federation, and now we are fused into one nation. And Coupland really thought that this was then how, India and Pakistan would be federated and then eventually fuse, and there would be peace. And same with the Arabs and Jews of Palestine would need separate states at first, and then they'll eventually, and then bridged by the Commonwealth, and then they'll eventually be able to form a single nation. So I think they were thinking a lot about their own federation in the United Kingdom. And they thought a lot about the Greek city-states in ancient history. That was a model they referred to as well. But I actually don't know if yes or no about whether they did think about Canada and its federation, which was also, they loved making federation. They made a federation in South Africa too. So, and they were always, even, in India, they were trying to make a federation with the princely states, right? So federation is a very important theme in British official thinking, as a way of accommodating different demands from colonial peoples. And so it's part of the toolkit, maybe even earlier. Yeah.
Kapil Kapoor says, how far are the fortnightly reports written and documented by governors of provinces, especially Punjab, to Viceroy around the time of partition, authentic? And if any facts are brushed under the carpet?
I think any official documents by the British in the colonial period have to be read very carefully and against the grain. You must consult them if you're interested in history of this period, but you do have to be aware of their, it's like internal propaganda, right? So they're writing in a certain way to please their superiors. Also, they don't always understand and know what's going on the ground. And, you know, there's a great case of like Nauroji in the 19th century. Dadabhai Nauroji was one of the founders of the Indian National Congress, who went through all those British government reports, the moral and material progress reports that the India Office would put out, and found how many of their statistics were just wrong and fake. But then he found ways to use some of their other more reliable statistics, like the revenue numbers, to prove how much Britain was impoverishing India. So there are ways you can use the statistics and records, but you always have to be wary, like just beware, you know, what you can and can't trust, and check them against other sources as much as possible.
Okay, thank you so much, Kapil. I hope that answered your question. And Professor Priya Satia, thank you so much. You've just been absolutely amazing. We've gone over time, and there are many more questions coming in, but we have to wrap up. But I know this has been an absolutely phenomenal session for everyone, such an informative, insightful session. Thank you so much for agreeing to take out time to be with us on Sunday Stories Live from the 1947 Partition Archive. It means a lot that you would share your research, your knowledge, and your time and yourself with us. So thank you so much for being here tonight.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for your questions, and thanks for listening. Really appreciate it. Good to meet you, Sonam.
Lovely to meet you as well, and I hope we'll see more of you next time for another topic of conversation. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Please understand that the 1947 Partition Archive relies 100% on donations as an NGO, so please consider making a donation of any size. And in some countries, donations are tax-free, so you have no reason not to donate. You'll have a chance to keep oral histories alive and, of course, have such interesting conversations with people like Priya. Links are in the description to this video. Thank you so much once again, Priya, for joining us, for sharing the stage with us, and see you all next Sunday. Good night.